Welcome to the Holistic Psychiatrist Podcast, a place for inspiration, insight, and information on holistic mental health. Join your host, Dr. Alice Lee, and discover critical information on safe, effective psychiatric medication withdrawal. Explore new ideas that enlighten and expand the mind with cutting-edge authors and experts, along with former patients as they share their miraculous healing journeys. It's time to build your well-being from the thought up. It's time for the Holistic Psychiatrist Podcast. Here's your host, Dr. Alice Lee.
Hello, and welcome to the Holistic Psychiatrist Podcast, a place for building well-being from the thought up. I'm your host, Dr. Alice Lee, the holistic psychiatrist practicing in Salt Lake City, Utah. For more information about my work and for free healing recordings, please check out my website, holisticcpsychiatrist.com. Thank you so much for listening today. Today, we'll be exploring religiosity and mental health with Tina, and Tina is her pseudonym. So Tina is a wonderful individual that I have had the honor of working with in my practice. She grew up in a devout Latter-day Saint home. Another name that you may have learned about the Latter-day Saints is Mormon. So she grew up in a Mormon Latter-day Saint home, and after a long history of conventional psychiatric treatment, Tina, who was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, decided to give holistic psychiatry a try after stopping all her medications. Unlike other patients who worked with me, Tina's amazing healing process and continued well-being heavily dependent on a deeper understanding of how spirituality, religiosity, institutional and community expectations, and faith impacted her mental health and identity. So I hope you'll stay with us and join us in our fascinating discovery of how faith in spiritual freedom and unconditional love can move the mountains of mental illness. Thank you, Tina, for being on our podcast today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Yes, it's always wonderful when I have the opportunity to enjoy an interview with someone whom I've worked with and who've had a really wonderful outcome with their treatment. I always learn so much from my patients, and I think today's podcast will be especially helpful for those people who are interested in the mind-body connection and how our lives can be impacted by spirituality, right?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So let's start by having you share a little bit about yourself, your age, your background, and your interests, and some of the things that you've done in your life. Mm-hmm.
I am 37 years old. I'm married and I have 3 children. I'm currently living in Japan with my family. Growing up, my family moved around quite a bit. We lived in South Korea when I was younger, and then I spent the majority of my childhood growing up in Utah. And then in high school, I lived in the South, in Tennessee. I was born and raised in the LDS Church, the Latter-day Saint Church, the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, or the Mormon Church. On my father's side, that goes back for many generations. One of my grandfathers was one of the early founders of the church. And on my mother's side, I'm a 3rd generation in the church. Some of my interests, especially when I was a young adult, I was heavily involved in vocal performance and stage acting. I love to write and read. I love studying history. I have a background in elementary education, and I'm using that now. I'm currently homeschooling my children, which I love to do. I think ultimately my number one passion is learning from storytelling, either hearing other people's stories, creating my own stories, experiencing stories. I think that is my passion. I'm currently working towards going back to school and getting a degree in journalism, which I think is fits in line with my passion for storytelling as well as history, its current history. And I'm excited to be healthy enough to finally pursue that. So,
wow, that's great. One of the things that I've really enjoyed in working with you is to see you go from struggling with your moods to seeing you being much more resilient and seeing your mood being a lot more positive and very stable and reliable. But before we go into that whole process, can you share a little bit about your struggle to find health through more of a conventional approach?
Sure. I struggled with my mental health. Of course, hindsight is 20/20, but I have memories from very early childhood of struggling with anxiety, perfectionism, and very much being driven by fear of disappointing the people around me, my parents and my community, my church, and even God. Most of my actions and my choices were very much about avoidance, avoiding the possibility of things going wrong and disappointing people around me. It wasn't until I was going through puberty, I was about 12 years old, that some of those deep issues that I'd had my whole life started to become more external and harder for me to hide and present in a certain way. I started at that age to struggle with some suicidal ideation. I had what I now recognize as panic attacks. I think myself and my family at the time saw it more as maybe even tantrums a little bit when I was uncomfortable in certain situations. But I think even though my parents maybe wondered why I was a little bit different my whole life, this was the first time that they thought, oh, maybe there's something more going on. But even after I shared I was terrified, but I shared that I was struggling with ideas of suicide. I think my parents came from a background and were living in a time that they didn't know what to do with that, and very much approached it from the lens of our religion and trying to figure out where those feelings were coming from, because the belief, stemming in a belief that if we feel that way, there must be something wrong in our lives and something needs to be fixed. So it was several years. I only brought up suicidal ideation one time with my family. I was devastated by the disappointment in the reaction of my parents, and I was very ashamed of those feelings that I had. And so even though there were other times that I did reach out for help when I was feeling depressed, I very much tried to shape it in a less disappointing way when I reached out for help. And it was many years before my parents, I think, reached outside of their own experience to try and find some help for me. They took me into a doctor and I was put on an antidepressant. I think one thing that's notable is my family has a lot of trust in the medical field, and they were very trusting of medications to help me with my mental health, but less so trusting when it came to maybe talk therapy or things that they saw as making me vulnerable to changing kind of my beliefs and the narrative that I had been raised with. And so they did reach out to conventional psychiatrists to help me, but the majority of my care growing up was solely through pharmaceuticals and not through any sort of conventional therapy.
I know that the LDS Church does have systems set up where they have LDS counselors for those who are struggling as well. Maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the ways in which this particular background or religion may have in terms of fears with psychotherapy, or how it might color how treatment is pursued for those people who are struggling with mental health. And also, if you can share how this particular religious institution look upon suicide.
Yeah, I do know that my parents they found it very important to find a psychiatrist that shared our values and our beliefs. They thought that it would be dangerous to go to a therapist who did not share our beliefs. I think that comes from a feeling of maybe victimization a little bit, that growing up in the Mormon church, there is a feeling of being misunderstood by the broader world or persecuted in some way. And I think even in my experience, I did run across some experiences where people were actively trying to dissuade you from your deeply held beliefs. I think now I realize that wasn't always done in a malicious way, but I think that is a deeply held belief in the religion that I grew up, that maybe Satan in some way is trying to use the world and use people outside of the church to bring doubt into our beliefs. And so I think my parents and many people in the church equate that with fear of going to a therapist where you open up your heart and your soul to someone and give them the opportunity to maybe infiltrate a little bit and leave some ideas that aren't congruent with the mainstream beliefs in the church. And so even though my parents did not go through the church system, I think it's the family support system for therapy, they did look for a psychiatrist that was a member of the church that they felt would be fully supportive of our beliefs and the way my parents were raising me and all of that. So I do think that had an impact on the care that I received in that I remember the first time that I went into a doctor, my mom was with me, and they asked if I had any trauma from my childhood or anything like that. And I knew that I didn't have any significant events that were traumatizing, but I was trying to express that I never felt right. I never felt okay. There was always something a little bit different in the way I interacted with the world than what I was seeing or what I was being told was expected of me. And from both my mom and the psychiatrist, very quickly that was turned into, you have a wonderful, stable home. You're being raised in the gospel. You have been blessed with, we weren't poor. There wasn't anything big outwardly that should have been causing me to be depressed. And so even though I was in a very inexperienced way trying to explore why I was reacting to the world the way I was, it was very quickly evident to me that I needed to be very grateful for the situation that I was in, and that everything that was going wrong solely must have to do with the structure of my brain, because there was no reason for me to be unhappy. And though I think there is truth in that, I think that not having the ability to explore other causes of my anxieties or my emotions really rooted in me that I needed to approach my mental health from the perspective of something being broken with my body. And it shut off any sort of internal or external dialogue to explore how my personality in conjunction with my community may have been at least exacerbating some of the physical and genetic issues that I probably was born with. And so I think that for me, it also shaped the way that I interacted with doctors for most of my life, where I felt that I needed to be very careful about expressing dissatisfaction with my life, that I needed to express my gratitude for the beautiful life that I had and say, well, I just need a little bit of help. I just need a little bit of help. And I think often that led to less than genuine, open conversations with my doctors to really address how bad things really were. So I do think, a combination of my personality, but the belief system in which my parents were approaching getting me care as a child did set the stage for how I sought for care for a long time. I did look for people who shared my beliefs, and I felt very uncomfortable if I would go to a doctor, even who was a member of the church, who in any way stepped out of that initial box that I had been exposed to of what healthy, safe psychiatric care would be.
I see. The other question I had posed is if you could help us understand a little bit more about the church's attitude towards suicide.
Yes, I think all of these questions, can be very difficult because there's a difference between the doctrine from the institutional church and the church. The people in the church are not a monolith. And so I think that there's many different range of beliefs. I also think the attitude towards suicide has changed immensely within the church in my lifetime. So when I speak of maybe my family's beliefs in suicide, I do think that is heavily influenced by the doctrines of the church, and it is a belief that is shared by many members, but I wouldn't say that it's the current way that the church approaches suicide, or maybe even what all members believe, of course. But I think from an early age, especially my father, even in his attempt to understand things that he hadn't experienced himself, trying to use principles of the religion that we grew up in to make sense of new information caused him to make some maybe extreme conclusions about suicide. So I think I was taught growing up that if we live righteously in the gospel of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that we will have joy, maybe even a greater joy than the outer world, and any sort of feelings that aren't congruent with that joy must be coming from something that is off in our lives. Either we're actively sinning, or we just have the wrong attitude, or we don't understand the principles of the gospel, that if you truly are living the principles of the gospel, you will not struggle with depression or suicidal ideation. And so when I expressed to my parents that I was struggling with suicidal ideation, I think my dad's genuine reaction was fear. He was worried about me, but the best way that he knew how to dissuade me from having those feelings was to point out maybe the causes of those feelings. And so that conversation very much was around selfishness and misunderstanding of gospel principles, and that if I was truly a selfless person that was following God, then those thoughts and those feelings would go away. So that's the personal view that I think my father held, but I think that it isn't maybe rare in the church, especially in that generation. And I also think it comes from, in the LDS church, there is this feeling of there's always a solution to something. There's always a purpose and a reason for things. And there is a lot of fear in being confronted with something that we don't understand or we don't have an answer for. And so sometimes we, instead of genuinely absorbing this new experience that my father had not experienced himself, he had to twist it a little bit to fit it into what already made sense. And I think that I still confront that sometimes in people that I interact with in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that there's much more compassion now towards suicidal ideation. The language from the general authorities has changed, that we love and have compassion for them, but there still is a bit of language that it will be a message of, this is how we find joy in our life. And if you haven't found that joy, I'm really sorry. And we love you and we kind of feel bad for you, but, endure and it'll all be made right someday. And I think that can still, though that it's a lot more benevolent than some of the past messages regarding suicide, where suicide is a sin, that there will be eternal punishment. I think that still can be very harmful when it doesn't open up the opportunity to have a conversation about broader causes for suicidal ideation, or even how to find hope, joy, and purpose in the midst of struggling with depression or suicidal ideation. And I think that's something I've struggled with, and I've had to shift my own beliefs in order to have a more positive relationship with my tendency for suicidal ideation.
Yeah. Well, as you know, I am quite familiar with the church doctrines since I grew up in the church, even though currently I'm not a member. But I don't think growing up I was really given a very clear understanding of, well, what happens to people who commit suicide, who choose to go that route. And we're not a religion that believes in reincarnation. We believe that there's just this one chance, and whatever you do is going to have eternal ramifications. So I'm going to have to ask you, as the expert here, what is the church's, standing when it comes to those who do end their lives?
I think the current kind of official language that has been used recently in general conference and things, I would have to look up their current handbook and their wording on that. But my understanding is that they're leaning more into, we don't know. We don't know what happens when people commit suicide, and that's something that we can't understand. And it is leaning more into, we need to approach those situations with love and not being judgmental. And, most likely there was a disease that caused that to happen. Nice. So I do feel like it's a positive change from,
definitely.
from where they used to be. So.
Another thing that we had talked about is that when you struggled with your health issues and, some of the conventional approaches weren't working as well as, your parents had hoped, that there was a second layer to the way in which things were turning out that had to do with the religiosity and the institution, its effects, because your father had many important callings in the church. And there is this, feeling that if his children left the church, or if they're struggling in some way, or, if they were to really struggle with mental health issues, that it reflected on them in terms of the way they maybe raise their children or is implementing the gospel in the home. And so in some ways, there's a way in which mental illness can have an impact on the parents', I guess, own sense of security or their own self-esteem, right?
I think so. Of course, I can't speak for my father, but I've tried to understand our relationship and understand, where he is coming from. I do have friends that I've had conversations with who are maybe older, maybe more in my parents' generation, and had more open conversations with them about their struggles with their children dealing with mental illness or deciding to no longer be a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And it's really opened my heart and my eyes to the burden and the anxiety that many of, I think, parents in the church, maybe more so in older generations, felt because of the way the way the principles were taught in the church, being that, first of all, having children in our church is the greatest responsibility that we have in this church. And on top of having those children, raising those children in righteousness. And I know that there are some scriptural promises, some anecdotal promises that if you live in a certain way and you do certain things, such as family scripture study or family home evening, and you have gospel discussions in the home, that will build a foundation that will make it very difficult for your children to stray. And I think there is a little bit of dissonance between this responsibility laid on parents to feel culpable in the choices of their children and the teaching of agency, which our church teaches as fundamental to God's plan, that we all make our own choices. And I think even though it is at times explicitly taught that the children are responsible for their own choices, there is maybe an unspoken belief that permeates in the church that there is shame in having children that leave the church or struggle with mental health issues or even same-sex attraction or any of these things that fall outside of the norm. I think there is a cultural and underlying belief that the blame is put a little bit on the parents, or again, going back to there's an answer to everything. So why did their child leave? It must have been because they didn't spend enough time in scripture study or this or that, instead of just, it's a life experience and things happen. I think that it can be very difficult for parents in the church to let go of that responsibility and that burden.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, you did go through a lot of medications, so I wanted to go there next. How did the conventional medications address your problems, and why did you choose a more holistic approach at this point in your life?
So as I started to say before, that I started taking medication as a teenager, and it was an SSRI, just a standard. It was Zoloft and a couple others. I don't remember everything that I took, but it was very much approached from, it was a quick fix. So I was given medication. I took it for a very short time. I felt better, and then they would take me off the medication. And looking back now, I don't know how much of that was a result of the medication and how much of that was my natural mood swings. But I felt at the time that, I took a pill, I'm fixed, I'm all better. And I would get frustrated when I would have to keep going back, when I would struggle again. It wasn't until I moved away from home and I went to college that I really started to struggle with my mental health. And I think a lot of that was now being in an environment where I was being confronted with things that didn't fit the model that I had been raised with. And so I had a lot of maybe confusion about who I was and what I wanted and things like that. But from a physical standpoint, I was overburdening myself in school. I was taking too many classes. I was working too hard. I was not sleeping regularly. I was not eating well. And that triggered, I think, more of a physiological response that then was exacerbated by some of these new life experiences that I was having. I started having extreme mood swings where I would go a couple weeks without getting out of bed, and then I would feel amazing and I would stay up all night for several nights in a row. And I got to a point where in large part, I was enjoying life. I was experiencing new things, and I struggled with those really depressive episodes, but I really enjoyed those, what I now understand to be hypomanic episodes. And it wasn't until my parents realized that my grades were not so great when I was in college that they started to be concerned that something was off. And so my mom came out and took me to a doctor, and it was the same thing as before. I was put on an antidepressant, and I did start to feel better really quickly. They took me off of it really quickly, and it was after that episode going on medication that I started to be a lot more erratic in my behavior. I ended up quitting school. I got a job that was far away from where I was going to school. And I look back now and I think that there were a lot of factors in all of that, one of which most definitely my mental health from a physiological standpoint. But I think my parents were much more concerned from a spiritual standpoint, that I wasn't behaving in a way that made sense to them. And so they kind of gave me an ultimatum and asked me to move home. So I chose to move home, and being back in an environment which was much more controlled and maybe some of my options were taken away a little bit, it did help with my stability a little bit. I was sleeping better, I was eating better, and I was no longer acting quite as erratically. However, I was deeply, deeply depressed. But that was maybe from the outside looking in much safer than the hypomanic behavior that I was exhibiting before. So from the time that I went home until the time that until I got married, which was only a couple years later, I didn't seek any traditional medical help for my mental health. I felt like, I'm doing the things that I'm supposed to be doing. I'm okay. Like, this is good enough. And it wasn't until my first child was born that I started needing outside help for my mental issues. I struggled with postpartum depression pretty severely. And we were living overseas at the time, and it was in a country that doesn't have a huge amount of support for mental illness, specifically pregnancy and mothering related depression. It's seen as something that you just kind of deal with. Everybody deals with it. And so I didn't get good support during that time. But when my husband and I started discussing having another child, I really wanted another baby, but I was terrified. I was terrified to have another child and experience what I had experienced the first time around. So I met with an OBGYN and discussed my concerns and made the decision that as soon as the baby was born, I would go directly onto an antidepressant and I would stay on it for as long as needed. I think in hindsight, it would have been better if I had worked with a psychiatrist instead of only an OBGYN, but at the time it was the right decision based on the knowledge and information that I had. So I did start taking Zoloft as soon as my daughter was born, and it did help immensely I did not struggle with postpartum depression, and I had a much more positive experience with my daughter when she was a newborn. But when she was about 1 year old, my mental and my physical health started to decline significantly. Mentally, I felt very numb and disassociated, and I went into a psychiatrist. I started to see a psychiatrist, and I expressed that I didn't feel like the medication was doing what it was supposed to. I wasn't really happy I wasn't depressed, but I just wasn't living really. And I also expressed some physical symptoms that I was having, a major one being weight gain. When my daughter turned 1, I suddenly started to gain weight very, very rapidly. Even when I was working with a personal trainer and a nutritionist, I gained about 100 pounds in a very short amount of time. I was sick all the time with viruses. I had unexplained bruising. My hair was starting to fall out. I was having very significant physical, struggles at that time. And I expressed that to my psychiatrist. In regards to the physical issues, he very quickly said, no, those cannot be caused by the Zoloft. You must have something else going on. And in regards to the mental illness struggles that I was having, the response was to just up my dosage. So I started to see many other doctors being passed around from specialist to specialists, and so many tests being done. Every doctor that I went into, I would express or ask, could this be because of the Zoloft? And every single doctor said, no, it's Zoloft doesn't do this. And so they would do tests, nothing would come back definitive. And ultimately they would say, oh, you just need to lose weight. And that was so deeply frustrating because the weight was one of the symptoms. And I just felt very dismissed, and that was happening at the same time as working with a psychiatrist, going in and saying, I'm depressed, or I feel numb, or I don't feel right. And the response constantly being just to continue to up my dosage. And even trying different doctors, I was getting the same approach from many different doctors. And so I finally got to a point where I just thought, well, this is as good as it's going to get. This is just my life.
I wanted to interject a little bit here with the weight gain and hair loss. Weight gain and hair loss are somewhat related in that the hair tends to fall out when a person is struggling with a lot of toxicity issues. And also fat cells actually is a place for holding toxins. So a lot of people who may have difficulty with getting rid of toxins might store these toxins in the fat cells. So weight gain is oftentimes a problem with a lot of medications. So when doctors say that weight gain isn't associated with medications, maybe what they're saying is that from their perspective, the majority of patients, don't struggle with these types of symptoms. But then you have to consider, not everybody is a cookie cutter, the same person. And what they have to be open to is that there are certain people who have difficulty with detoxification of medications. That's what I tend to see a lot of, is patients who struggle with detoxification and they gain a lot of weight on medication. So it definitely is associated with medication. So I just wanted to interject with that.
Yeah, thank you. I think I understand that, and I see that now on this side of healing, that makes so much sense. Once I got a lot of those toxins out of my body, everything else just kind of fell into place. And even at the time when I was going through it, deep in my heart, in my soul, I felt like there was something wrong. I knew that the medications were the root of a lot of what was going on, but I just didn't know what to do about it. And anytime I would express maybe going off the medication to my doctors, either my standard doctors or my psychiatrists, very quickly the response is, no, it's always a bad idea to go off of your medication. Whatever's on the other side of medication is worse than what you're experiencing now. And so I was afraid. I was afraid to try something different, even though I knew in the deep parts of me that this was wrong and things were just getting worse. And I stayed on antidepressants for many years. And then I got pregnant again. And I was terrified to be on medication while I was pregnant. My health was already not great, and I was really afraid about being pregnant and going through that pregnancy. But I was very much encouraged by all of my doctors to stay on the medication, and the reasoning was, your mental health isn't great now. Obviously, it's going to be worse if you go off the medication. And so I stayed on the medication during my pregnancy. And though I don't have a definitive answer as to whether or not the medication caused the issues in my pregnancy, it was a very, very difficult, traumatic pregnancy, and it ended in a late-term miscarriage, which was very, very difficult. I got pregnant again very, very quickly after that loss. And again, I was terrified. It was within a couple of months I found that I was pregnant again. And again, I wanted to go off the medication, and I kept saying, I really feel like the medication might have had something to do with my issues before. Again, I was very much encouraged to stay on, and I wasn't mentally healthy enough to advocate for myself well. And so I gave my trust over to my doctors, who I truly believe were well-meaning and doing the best they could with the information they had. And it was, again, a very, very difficult pregnancy, but my son was born relatively healthy. He did have some signs of withdrawal when he was born. He had some breathing issues, but he is alive and well and perfectly fine now, so that was a miracle. But it was a few months. I struggled while he was an infant, while he was a newborn. It was different than the postpartum depression that I had experienced before. It was complete disassociation. I was struggling to engage in any way with my family and with my baby. I was functioning okay. I was taking care of the things that I needed to take care of, but I felt like I was watching someone else do it. And my dear husband, watching all of this happen for years and years, was really concerned and wanted me to be better. And after discussing with doctors about going off medication and never really getting their go-ahead, I decided to wean myself off medication on my own. And I did as much research as I could. As I'm not a doctor, but there are a lot of resources available to regular people now, and I tried to do it the safest and best way that I could. And I kept a journal of making sure of my moods and everything. And I spent about a year slowly going off of the Zoloft. And as soon as I started tapering off of the Zoloft, my physical symptoms started to improve immensely. My memory was better. My engagement with my family was better. I stopped getting sick all the time. I had a few years where I got shingles outbreaks every few months. That went away. I stopped bruising. My hair came back in. I started to lose weight, even though that's still something that I'm working on. But without making any other changes, I started to lose weight once I started to taper off of the Zoloft. And that gave me a lot of confidence, that experience that I do know things about my body that maybe doctors can't trump. And after about a year, I was completely off the Zoloft, and I was doing really well, both physically and mentally, comparatively. Not nearly as well as I am doing now, but I had hope that life could be better than what I was being told. It's either this or something worse. And I did really well for a long time, but eventually I started to have some pretty extreme mood swings, high and low. And I did get nervous because of what I had been told in the past, that I had made a mistake by going off of the medication. So I did go into a new psychiatrist who was wonderful. She was wonderful, and she started fresh, and I approached the experience very differently, and I was very open and honest about my whole life and what I was going through in that moment. And I just was at a point where I was no longer embarrassed or felt like I needed to keep up a front. I needed help, and I was finally ready to be very open about that. And she diagnosed me with bipolar disorder. Yes.
I was just curious, how long after you stopped the Zoloft did you start noticing mood swings?
It was within the first year, and it was about a year after I fully went off the Zoloft that I went into a new psychiatrist. I was on both sides of the spectrum. When I was depressed or when I was manic, I was having a hard time keeping up with housework and making dinner and kind of, what I saw at the time as my responsibilities as what made me a good mother. And that's what ultimately led me to, I need to get some help. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And when you said you had these mood swings, how frequently were the mood swings happening to you?
In the beginning, it was probably every month or so. I would, and my depressive episodes were much longer than my hypomanic episodes. So I would go through maybe even 2 or 3 months of being pretty severely depressed. And then I would have a few weeks to maybe a little over a month of hypomania, which I know that's what it is now. I didn't know that at the time, but I just would think everything was amazing and I would spend all sorts of money, and that would last for a few weeks, and then I would go back into a depressive episode. And when they first started, they were gradual. I would slowly become very depressed and then slowly work up to hypomania, and the cycle would continue. But
would you have periods of just more neutral mood in between?
Not at that time, no.
Oh, okay.
I think I felt like I was neutral, but as I would track my moods, and I would hit a brief period of maybe neutrality, but it was a constant flow of going up and down. And what ultimately led me to seek out help was it became more rapid and more extreme, that I would go from deep, deep depression without that gradual incline or decline. I would shoot up to hypomania, and then something would happen and I would be severely depressed again. And it was getting to a point where I didn't have those gradual in-betweens to kind of catch up on housework or whatever it was. I was very much viewing my life from externally, what am I capable of doing? And I just wasn't capable of fulfilling my obligations. So I went in to a new doctor, and she spent a lot of time with me and eventually landed on the diagnosis of bipolar disorder, undefined. She did not diagnose me with either 1 or 2 because I showed kind of some symptoms of both. But she did, after a while, start me on some bipolar medications. I believe Latuda was the first one that she started me on. And I reacted to those medications so much better than the antidepressants. And I felt right there at the beginning when I started those medications that I've found my solution. I have a real diagnosis. I have the right medication now. And I felt better than I had ever felt in my life first starting those medications. I did right away start to have some physical side effects, but this doctor was much better and much more educated about the physical side effects. And so it was a better conversation when I'd come in and I'd say, my hands are shaking. And she would say, oh, that's the medication. And so I was willing to put up with the physical symptoms because I wasn't being dismissed, and it made sense to me. But I did find after a few months that the medication wasn't working as well. And so we switched to a different medication. And this went on for several years where a medication would stop working. I'd try 3 or 4 medications. Some of them would be horrible. Some of them would be okay. Then we'd find one that worked pretty well, and that would work well for a while. And then it would stop working. And my doctor was feeling that I was fairly medication resistant. For some reason, my body was adapting to the medications really quickly, within a few months usually. I eventually settled on Vraylar, which worked well. It was a good balance of, I didn't feel like the physical symptoms were horrible. It was keeping me fairly stable, but I felt again like I was reaching a point where this is as good as it gets. And it just wasn't a life that was full of joy, or I wasn't well enough to live my life to the fullest, but I started to kind of just accept that as the way it was. But I did continue to decline physically being on medications. I started to have thoughts of, I probably won't live very long. I'm not a very healthy person. Physically, I'm not a healthy person, but it's better to stay on these medications and live a shorter, safer life than a long, very miserable, scary life. And that's where I sat for a long time. But then I found out that my family was going to be moving to Japan with my husband's work. And that was a really terrifying prospect because that's where I had lived before when my son was an infant. And I knew that the mental health care system was maybe not as dynamic as the mental health care system is in the United States. And they also don't have nearly as many medications available for bipolar disorder here in Japan. And the medications that are available are medications that I had already tried in the past and hadn't been very successful with. So I was faced with a really, really difficult decision. It was either my husband does not take the position and we stay where we are, which would have been not a very great career move. Or my husband goes and does his assignment in Japan and we are separated while I stay in the United States. And we explored many, many different options. And ultimately, I said, I want to try to go off of medication. I want to see, I feel like I've learned a lot. I was much better at managing my sleep, managing my diet, exercising, getting outside every day. Having a long period of stability helped me to solidify some much healthier habits in my life. I was much better at knowing my capacity and not taking on responsibilities that were too much for me. And so I felt confident that I could try going off of medication, see how I felt for a few months, and then that would help us make the decision as to whether or not we would try moving to Japan and see how things went. And my doctor was on board with this. She was very supportive of it and helped me through that process. And I did really well coming off of the medication. I did have stronger mood swings being off of the medication, but I was able to recognize them much better now that I was educated and kind of head them off. When I noticed I wasn't sleeping as much, I would adapt and, my environment. And I did very, very well. And I felt confident that we could try moving to Japan. The caveat was that we would try it, and if things went bad, I had the option of coming back if I needed to. And so we moved to Japan. My physical health after moving to Japan continued to improve a lot because of the diet here and the availability of fruits and vegetables in season and lifestyle where you walk more places. That really, really helped to continue that journey of better physical health. My mental health was good. It was hard moving back to a foreign country and all of the things that come with that, but I felt confident in the way that I was handling the struggles that I was going through. And I did very, very well for almost a year and a half, I would say, while we were living here in Japan. And then we took a trip back home and visited family. And after that trip, it triggered a cycle for me, and I was fairly hypomanic for probably about a month and a half, and I was struggling to rein it in. And then I had a pretty quick dive into depression. And in some ways, it was one of the worst depressions that I've ever had in my life. And that really, I think part of why it was one of the worst was because I was frustrated that it was happening again. And so that kind of made the depression even worse because I didn't think I would ever experience that again. And here I was kind of back at square one. And my mental health very quickly spiraled into dangerous territory. I've always on some level struggled with thoughts of self-harm and suicidal ideation, even while medicated, but generally, they were fairly abstract feelings or ideas, but I started again to have more poignant and specific thoughts of suicide, and that was really scary. I also had grown in my relationship with my husband. I was much more open with him. When I'd struggled with those things in the past, I kept them secret, but I was much better about talking about those things openly with my husband, which was good because I was not in a great mental state, but he was able to talk through it with me and say, you need some help. This is not normal. We need to get you some help. So I did see a few doctors here in Japan, and I was very, very frustrated that as soon as I would go in and they would see my diagnosis of bipolar disorder, there was no talk of any other option except for very strong pharmaceuticals. And I didn't take anything that was prescribed by several doctors that I went to. I did go to one doctor that prescribed me a Chinese herbal medicine that I was willing to try. It seemed different to me because it wasn't a chemical pharmaceutical, and it did help with my mental symptoms, but I was also having physical symptoms. It was making me very sleepy, and it didn't feel any different than the chemical pharmaceuticals that I'd been on before. And so I really felt like I had tried. I had done my due diligence while living here in Japan. I had worked with doctors. I had tried things that they had asked me to do, and it wasn't getting any better. And I had quite honestly gotten to a point, of course, we talked about me going and living back in the United States and going back to my old doctor. But even that just I didn't want that. I felt so much better for a long time than I had ever felt in my life, physically and mentally, and I felt empowered in my own care. And I just felt like there had to be another option out there. And so both my husband and I started to do more research into different ways of approaching mental illness, specifically bipolar disorder. That brought us to many options. I considered inpatient care. I considered going to more of the holistic kind of like camps that they have where I just need to be put away for a while and fix this. I considered going back to my old doctor. I looked into different holistic approaches. I did focus a lot on diet, and so I did start to change my diet and eating foods that were specifically recommended for bipolar disorder. And though I did see a improvement, it just wasn't enough. I was still in that danger zone of not being stable enough to feel completely safe. So my husband just was looking for a doctor that was somewhere in the range of where my parents lived. So I had somewhere to go home to the States, stay with family, have some help taking care of the kids while I took care of myself. And he found your name. He was very excited and encouraged by something different that we had never heard before. And I didn't really understand your approach to mental health outside of, supplementation and diet. But I honestly felt so broken that I was like, let's try anything was where I was at. And it worked well for me in regards to where my family was and being able to spend some time getting well. So that's the struggle that I went through that ultimately led me to you and to holistic psychiatric care.
Wow. So you didn't travel all the way from Japan to Utah specifically to see me, huh? No.
I did. I do see in hindsight, and my husband has said the same thing, that we were doing the best we could with the information we had, but I very much feel that there was a divine hand in all of it, because now that I know more about holistic medicine, I couldn't have found a better doctor. Really, I genuinely feel that way. Just with your own life experiences and what led you to where you are, it helped me feel more comfortable being open to this new way of doing things. I think that if I had gone to a different doctor that maybe didn't share some of my own background, I would have been much more wary and afraid coming from those initial experiences with psychiatrists and my family's beliefs. So,
Yeah. Well, usually when I work with patients, I do end up giving them quite a list of supplements, but that was not the case with you. We did choose a few supplements, some specific B vitamins that were especially good for methylation, for example, is very helpful. But you were not given a whole list of supplements, just a few supplements. And we did do some energy medicine interventions. And you actually didn't have that many sessions with me in Utah before you went back to Japan. So I was hoping that you could share with the audience who are listening, like, what happened with your treatment that made it work for you, because it just wasn't the typical bipolar patient that I encountered. So, so go ahead and share your story.
I think, firstly, I was already well on the way physically to being healthier. So I already was eating a very healthy diet, very well balanced, nutrient dense diet. And so I don't think that a lot of supplements were needed for me. I needed just a few to really kind of heal my gut and to kind of detoxify a little bit. And everything that I was already doing started to work better. And so I definitely saw a change very quickly there, because I feel that I had already laid that groundwork. I had already started to approach mental health from that perspective of holistic medicine, but having a deeper understanding of how my body was holding on to toxins and how to balance my gut a little better was just the tipping point for me to everything I was already doing to work much better.
Which teaches us a lot about the importance of diet.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
And I think
a lot of conventional doctors underestimate the importance of diet. But
they absolutely do. And they will focus a lot on weight loss and being at a healthy weight. But I would go in and I would ask for help. I would ask for, just managing, being in a calorie deficit and exercise isn't working. There's got to be something more. And there just wasn't any support in the mainstream medical world to understand inflammation, and even living in Japan, eating a lot of fermented foods and how that helps my gut absorb nutrients better. And it certainly is a very important foundation. And where I am today was understanding how important what I take into my body is.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's have you share a little bit about the energy medicine piece, because I feel like that was a big piece for you in terms of the healing process. So if you can
It absolutely is.
Uh-huh.
I think this story is hard to tell without kind of talking a little bit about what was happening more broadly in my life. I think that I was in a very unique situation and environment that set me up to be very open to the energy healing. It was very, very difficult for me to leave part of my family behind in Japan. It was just myself and my youngest son that came back to the United States to focus on my health. And that was a very, very difficult decision for me to make. And I was very racked with guilt for leaving my older two children. And it was open-ended. I didn't know how long I was going to be in the United States or whether or not what I was going to try was going to work. And so that was very difficult. It was also one of the first times, if not the first time, that I was spending a significant amount of time with my family, essentially living with them without my husband with me. So that was an interesting dynamic to somewhat feel like a child again and feel, I was living in my parents' home and subject to their expectations and everything, which isn't, my lifestyle is not much different than my parents' lifestyle, but there is always a little bit of a different dynamic when you're living in your parents' home. And I think even more so in my relationship with my parents, I think it is still very much a parent-child relationship. And so that was hard to kind of step into and try and be a good house guest / roommate, and also not kind of lose myself in the expectations of my parents. And that was all kind of wrapped up in just, how to care for a home, but on a broader sense, religion and, how active I am in going to the activities or going to church. And at that time I was deeply depressed. And so getting up and showering and going to a church meeting was extremely difficult. And I didn't want my parents to worry about me. And so in some ways I was going through motions of doing things more for them than for my health. So that was a somewhat difficult circumstance. Also, my parents had never seen me significantly mentally ill. I was very good growing up in their home at masking a lot of the inner turmoil that I was going through. And even though I've shared with them a little bit my struggles over the years, they've never seen it. They don't know the reality of living with someone with bipolar disorder. And I was terrified for them to see me that way because I didn't want to disappoint them. I also didn't know if they would like me very much. That, I think they like who I think I am, who they think I am, more so than if they really knew me. My whole life have had this deep-seated fear that if my parents really knew who I was, they would want nothing to do with me, I knew who I was and I didn't like myself very much. So of course they wouldn't like me very much. And so that was something that I didn't think a whole lot about going into that situation. And I found myself dealing with some identity issues, some self-esteem issues, kind of going back. I felt a little bit like I was going back in time and living as a child with my parents again. And that was a very difficult dynamic to be in. And it led to some conflicts with my parents and very uncomfortable situations. And that was all very, very difficult. My son was not doing great in that environment with my mental health and with some of the other high stress anxieties that were going on with everyone else living in the home. And so it was a lot. It was probably one of the worst places that I could have been, worst situations that I could have been for my mental health. But it broke me down to a place where I was willing to give up some of my stubbornness and the way things needed to be done and be very, very open to something that I normally would be very skeptical of. So I think that it was a blessing that I ended up in that situation at the same time as finding Dr. Lee and energy healing, because I don't think if I had found energy healing at any other time that I would have been as open to it as I was at that time. So the first, I think we had met maybe even a couple of times before we really did actual energy healing. And by the time we did actual energy healing, I just was very open to help me, please just help me. And that experience, the first time that we went through the energy healing and we were talking about what is true for me and what is not true for me, was a very spiritual experience for me. I felt very, very broken at that time. I felt my relationship with my parents was very, very strained. And they were the most important relationship in my life for most of my life. Pleasing them and them loving me and accepting me was so, so important. And seeing how upset they were with me and how disappointed they were with my mental health and some of the spiritual doubts and things that I was having made me feel very maybe unworthy and lost and confused. But in some way, that relationship with my parents was moved out of the way a little bit. I had lost hope in maybe their love for me in that time and the mental place that I was in. And that removed a barrier, I think, when we were doing the energy healing and you instructed me to open myself up to pure energy. I think that was the first time in my life that I felt directly connected to something divine, that I wasn't looking for someone else to explain that experience to me or to provide that experience for me or connect me to this divine spiritual experience in any way. It was very pure. It was very new to me, and it felt like the most true thing that I've ever experienced.
That's beautiful.
And it did feel like I had all of the barriers in my life, my family, my church, my beliefs, my insecurities had all fallen away. And it was just me in my pure form and this divine pure energy and this pure love. And that was a life-changing experience for me. And from that moment on, I was very open to the whole process of energy healing and feeling directly connected to that ability to be healed. And that was very foundational. And then I think as we moved forward, I very much enjoyed discussing things with you, Dr. Lee, and kind of digging down to what is it that I really believe? Why do I feel the way I do about myself? Why do I feel the way I do about the world around me? Why do I behave the way I behave? And really digging down and realizing that some of the things that cognitively I believed to be true were not in harmony with what I deeply subconsciously believed to be true. And so that was a really good exercise for me to come up with a very simple statement of something I wanted to be true, and then implementing that through the energy work. And it was easy for me to take a statement, for example, I deserve to be well, or God does not judge me based on my religiosity, that I didn't believe to be true on a fundamental level. And only after a few sessions, it felt right. I no longer was trying to make it fit into what I already knew or had been taught. It was just a very simple and pure truth that settled in my mind and in my soul, and really helped me to dismantle some of the more complicated ways that I had been living my life that weren't in harmony with something that felt so fundamentally true. And it really opened the door to help me know myself better, to love myself better, to feel more connected to God. And even though I don't think anything outwardly has changed significantly in my life, the way that I interact with the world has fundamentally and irrevocably changed because of those fundamental changes in belief.
Yes, I wanted to go to that one session we had right before you went back to Japan. And remember, I was doing the energy testing to see how strong your arm was before and after the energy work.
Mm-hmm.
And it was right around that very issue that you just mentioned, which is we did some very simple Empower Energy Technique, or EET, statements that you chose about basically unconditional love for yourself and self-acceptance for who you are. And I think up until then, I didn't know how much of an impact the idea of God not accepting you unless you are a certain way, and therefore you feeling always unworthy of God's, I guess, divine love, had such an impact on your health. Because during the EET, it was a couple of very simple statements, but it had at its core the intention to shift your energy so you would feel worthy, not only of being accepted as you are unconditionally, but also that you would feel worthy of God's love for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then I didn't think anything of that EET. I thought it was very basic of unconditional love. But I was completely blown away by the muscle testing on you after we did that energy work. I think that is where you, as a very unique individual coming with your own unique set of, experiences and traumas, needed that for healing your core issues. Because after we did that EET, I think you repeated it maybe twice or possibly 3 times, we muscle tested you, and your baseline went from just the average baseline to being very strong. I couldn't push your arm down. That was how strong your baseline was. And I don't know if you remember, but I think I told you that's very unusual to shift the entire baseline of someone's energy from wherever they were before the energy work to something that was really strong, because your baseline is all of the energies that can flow to you and all of the energies that you block. So whatever we had done with feeling loved and accepted and worthy as you are had pretty much unblocked a lot of the blockages for you. And you went from wherever you were used to a very high energy state. What I mean by high energy state is not hypomanic high energy state, but a very strong energy. You were really aligned with good energy by then, right after the EET. And ever since then, you've only improved. You've just continued to make good, steady improvement. Your mood has been very, I think, controlled and stable, and you've been able to manage it well. And so I think that EET right before you went to Japan was central to your healing process, not any supplement. I think the supplements are helpful, but I think that key core belief that you were worthy and lovable unconditionally was very central to your well-being. Because I think up to that point, spirituality and religiosity was intermeshed as one thing, you know? There was no separation between the two. And I think a lot of times there was this, you either are this spiritual religious being that was already described to you as this is who you're supposed to be, or you feel cast out and unworthy, because that was one of the ultimatums that was given to you, that you either had to fit into this kind of expectation of being part of the LDS kind of community, or you weren't welcome as a member of your own family. So this entwining or enmeshment between this religion and spirituality, I think up to a certain point, not only was used as, your foundational kind of identity, but it was kind of hit over your head. Like it was used as a bludgeon on your head. Like you either do this or you're like nobody, like you're cast out, right? Mm-hmm. So share with the audience a little bit about that kind of shift, that you didn't have to be this predetermined cast role thing that had already, all of the script written for you, or you had to be, rejected by a very important community to you. And this new shift, like in terms of your connection and love with God.
I think there's several factors that have landed me where I am today. I think a big one is my realization that the God that I was seeking to have a relationship with, I was very much confusing favor with love. And in the way I perceived or experienced things growing up in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I felt good when I was behaving well, and the people around me, I was in their favor, and I was making my family proud and they were happy with me. I was receiving meaningful responsibilities and callings within the community. I was welcomed into friend groups as someone who was safe to be, friends with. And without explicitly understanding that became fundamental to my relationship with God, that even though I was being told God loves you unconditionally, you are a child of God, the actual practices around me weren't supporting that belief. And the way I was making sense of it was that when I knew that I was doing all of the right things, God loved me and I was in his favor. That feeling of feeling okay with myself was what I confused for love. But in reality, it was just believing I was in God's favor. And I also equated feelings of shame with something virtuous to some extent, that it was some type of humility, that if I didn't feel shame, that I would never be motivated to grow and change and become better, that any sort of contentment with who I am in an imperfect state was wrong and sinful. And I think that's bolstered by the teaching that no unclean thing can live with God. And so that, in my black and white way of seeing things, I can't be happy with myself because I'm not good enough to be with God yet. And so it's a good thing that I feel so much shame and so much doubt in myself, because that's the only way that I'm going to be motivated to become a better person. And also, becoming a better person was very much in the framework of the things that I do, where I spend my time. Even, I believe, serving my fellow men is a good thing, but that's what I should be spending all of my time doing, is service just for the sake of service, even when maybe it's not the most effective service. The label of service is put onto many things, and I never spent a lot of time deeply thinking about, is this something that is good for the other person? Is it something that's meaningful to me? Is it something that gives me purpose in my life? But subconsciously, I felt that if I just racked up enough hours of service to God and church and my fellow men, that was making me someone worthy to be with God. So taking all of that out and giving myself permission to say, even if I don't check all of the boxes, I don't study my scriptures or even pray conventionally regularly or attend my church meetings or temple worship or whatever it may be, if I were to strip all of that away, let's say I was completely physically incapable of doing any of those things, what would be left, and would what was left be a good thing or a bad thing? And I was able to see myself much more purely and realize that the deepest desire of my heart is love, compassion, and understanding for all of the humans around me. That is what is most important to me, and that's still there, even if I didn't do any of these other things. That pure, just essence of who I am and what I want was still there. And that allowed me to have a more pure relationship with God, where I started to love and appreciate myself for who I am and my uniqueness and my quirks, and how that puts me in a unique position to relate to people. And that if I push all of that down and just try to become a model of there's only one way to be right, and this is the model for being right, I no longer have the ability to empathetically connect with people who are struggling and suffering. And so my imperfections are a virtue, and that helped me to reframe. I really love myself. And I even expressed to you at some point, I don't know that I want to be healed from my bipolar disorder. I think that it's been given a label, but largely my tendency for bipolar disorder is a big part of who I am and can be a virtuous thing. My ability to deeply feel things and if I can learn how to harness it, it can be something that can make me more Christ-like in my beliefs in Jesus Christ. The essence of Jesus Christ is pure love, and he's able to love us purely because he has perfect understanding for us. And I started to see my bipolar disorder as a gift that I was given to feel empathy for a broad range of emotions that foundationally is a tool that I have been given to make me more like Jesus Christ in seeking for a pure, perfectly understanding love. And I started to love myself and be really grateful for the person that not only I was born as, but the person that I've become through my own life experiences. And ultimately, I was able to see that I think Heavenly Father is the type of being that would really like me too. That he would be totally okay with who I am right now, and he would be excited for the experiences that I'm going to have for the rest of my life, even when they're imperfect. And that helped shift my view of my purpose here on this earth, that I'm not here to live in an imperfect world perfectly. I'm here to have many varied imperfect experiences in order to better understand my fellow beings. And that's it. That's why we're here. We're just here to experience things. And that totally shifted all of the choices that I make and the motivations behind what I do. And even as I am relearning how to engage with my Mormon community, a community that, regardless of all of the struggles that I've had, it is a unique and interesting and potentially very, very good community that I still in some way want to engage in. And some of the maybe the religiosity that I participated in before, I may continue to participate in, but it no longer is religiosity. It's simply a life experience that no longer is foundational to my spiritual well-being and my relationship to my fellow men and God. Yeah.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. I wanted to talk a little bit about how, as you shifted in your self-acceptance, you shared how you started to reconnect with a lot of people at a deeper level and reconnect with some relationships that you had cut off before because of the fact that maybe they didn't fit quite the recipe of the LDS community wanted as part of their membership, but that you started to feel great about your connection with other people of all sorts of different backgrounds, and that you didn't struggle as much with the us versus them kind of mentality as you did before.
Mhm.
And share a little bit about that, and how did that help you with your health? Like what has that got to do with health, one's health?
I think that one of the realizations that I had in this journey to accept myself and not judge myself based on my actions was the realization that I have never felt that way about other people. I judged myself based on the criteria that I felt I was being judged by or that other people were being judged by, but I personally never felt that way about other people. The way people dress or don't dress, or what they eat or don't eat, or how they choose to live, or who they marry or don't marry, or whether or not they have children. When I'm in a very personal and pure interaction with people that are very different than me, I don't have an internal sense of judgment, or I feel that maybe they're less happy than I am in any way. That's not something that ever rooted in me. However, there were many times where my behavior would show as such, when I would be put in situations where I felt that maybe in some way I was representing the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or I would have a friend share something deeply personal with me, and instead of just sharing what was in my heart and mourning with them and having that experience with them, I felt like I needed to have, as a member of Christ's one true church, I needed to have an answer for them, and that there had to be a reason why they were struggling, and most likely that was because they weren't a member of the church or weren't the right kind of member of the church. And even though I didn't fundamentally believe that about this other person, I saw them as people that were great influences in my life for good. I did continually fall back into the pattern that I was taught of being a missionary and having the right answers. And I, the last few months have looked back on my life, and I really started to mourn the missed opportunities of having real, authentic relationships with people that fit a different mold than what I was told was safe. And even though I loved them deeply and had very pure feelings towards them, my religiosity and my outward behavior did not set an environment for them to feel safe or comfortable or willing to open up to me completely. And even to the extent of, maybe some family members who never were because of their choices weren't fully accepted by my family. And there was never an uncomfortable environment where they felt to be a part of the family. Even though I knew it was wrong and it felt so wrong to me, I went along with it. I still said the right things that were expected of me, partly because for most of these moments I was a child and there wasn't much I could do anyway, but being able to look back on those experiences and see how I could do things differently now motivated me to reach out to people in the past that my relationship has just fallen flat or never grew because we were constantly hitting that wall of my own religiosity, and trying again to be myself, an authentic person, and showing my imperfections, and also creating an environment where they feel safe sharing their doubts and their struggles, and not responding with a solution or an answer that doesn't even come from me. It comes from an institution outside of me, but simply just being in that experience together. And I've had some really special moments the past few months in kind of going on that journey and reopening some of those doors, and maybe reframing some of my false interpretations of how they felt and why they did what they did, or how they felt about me, and really coming to a deeper understanding of them and myself through the process. And I think this has been one of the most important discoveries that I've made, that I do purely love people. I don't judge them for their religiosity, and being able to adjust my behavior, being able to dig down to that belief, know that that belief is true, and let that influence my behavior has given me a lot of hope for the rest of my life. And I'm excited for the opportunities that I have to meet people all over the world from different life experiences and grow from those opportunities to just connect with a fellow human being. And I think that more than anything has completely driven out any inklings of self-harm or suicidal ideation. It has, I feel like for most of my life, I lacked maybe even a survival instinct or a tether to this world. It felt dangerous to live in this world, that the longer I was here, the worse I was becoming, and everything was going to be so bad in the next life. And no longer worrying about, letting God take care of my salvation, and just living in each moment and having love and understanding be my motivation moment to moment, and letting go of these rules that have, a far off consequence, has given me purpose and meaning in my life, and I finally feel gratitude for this life and see it as a gift.
Yeah, you did mention how in the past you had always kind of thought of your life as preparing for the future, preparing for the spiritual realm, being worthy for the next step, but that in the healing process you started to live more in the present. And before you thought people who did that would be less happy, but now you're finding that you're more happy. So maybe you can share about that, because how sometimes religiosity is all about suffering now, being righteous, and then your reward would be in the afterlife, So you're not really fully grounded in living your life now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that that's something I was always taught growing up in the church, is that the only way to have a fullness of joy is within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that any sort of joy that anyone outside of the church or outside of living the principles, that it's a lesser joy or an echo of joy. And they don't know that they're not very happy because they haven't experienced real joy. And I think that was a hard concept for me, because I didn't feel a whole lot of joy in my life. And so I would have the thought many times, is this as good as it gets? Like, is it really worse? I don't feel great. Am I really going to feel worse? And I think having this, in some ways, a wall crumbled. I no longer see a wall between myself as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and anyone else in the world. It's just, we're all in it together. We're all on equal footing. And being able to take down that wall and interact with people in an authentic and equal way, I'm realizing that there are many, many people outside of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that are living a much more pure and full and joyful life than anything that I've ever experienced. And I'm beginning to experience that. But I also have realized that there are people within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who are truly living a pure and authentic and meaningful life. But as I get to know them better, and not through the lens of my understanding of the church and its expectations, I realize that these people, for whatever reason, were able to find within the church what I've, found by seeking outside of the church. Their motivations never were religiosity. Their motivations were pure love and connection. And the church is a tool that they use to have those connections with other people. And so that has further helped me kind of break down these walls of institutional religion and see it as a potential tool and blessing, as long as your spiritual foundation is healthy. Mm-hmm. And I think both sides of that, seeing, and it wouldn't fundamentally change who I am. I can choose the tool that I can use to have purpose and meaning in my life.
Yeah, beautiful. I wanted to emphasize how, as you were talking, what came to my mind is how much humility and courage it takes to make those shifts in your life. And also, as you were talking, I just saw so much wisdom in the way you are living your life now, and so much more freedom, so much more truth and authenticity. And how, even though we were talking about religiosity, its influence in our lives, our mental health, our community, our relationships, but it doesn't have to limit us, or it doesn't have to be anything that has power over us. We can use religiosity for good, and we can step aside and let it do its thing, and we would still be good. And that's a beautiful, beautiful point. We'll need to kind of wrap up, and I wanted to go to the last question. So the last question, which I hope you can leave the audience, is this: what is the core or main lesson? If you had one main lesson, what is the core main lesson you learned from your healing experience?
I think that the most important lesson is opening myself up to the idea that there are many different paths that you can follow in this life, and there isn't one prescribed way that works for everybody. And in kind of accepting that as a possibility, the most important lesson that I have learned over the last several months is that I am not fundamentally broken. There is nothing fundamentally wrong with me. I was just forcing myself to follow a path that did not fit. And yeah, so I mean, to put it simply, I'm not broken. I was just on the wrong path. And that's the most important lesson that I've internalized the last few months.
Wow. I love that. That's a beautiful message to leave with the audience. It's so important, I think, for those of us who are listening to integrate that wisdom in our lives, because I think so many times people with mental health problems do feel broken. They don't need religiosity to feel broken. They can go to all sorts of social institutions and hear that about themselves. And for them to be able to understand that it's not so much that they're broken, but they may need to find a different path that fits them is, yes, I think, a real key lesson. All right. Thank you so much, Tina, for sharing your wisdom, your courage, your humility, your growth with us today. I really appreciate everything that you've shared. You've been so open and haven't held anything back. You've just, opened up your heart, and I really appreciate that. So thank you very much for being on this podcast.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
For those of you who are listening, if you like what you've heard, please subscribe to this podcast for more helpful information. Share it with others and give this podcast a positive rating. I hope you'll subscribe to my holistic articles on my website, holisticspsychiatrist.com, where you'll find more wonderful articles, podcasts, and links to all of my social media platforms. However, I'm not much of a social media person, so if you want to reach out to me, just go to my website, to the contact section, and send me a text or message, and I'll be able to respond right away. If you do wish to integrate high-quality nutritional supplements from reputable sources and support my holistic practice financially, please register for FullScript's free online dispensary that helps to keep you supplied with the industry's largest catalog of professional-grade supplements available on my website under the Products tab. I look forward to sharing more insights with you through podcasts and articles, and hope you'll thrive as you build your life from the thought up. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.